Hey folks, do you know that 83% of medical devices are no longer patchable? What is it that you should do about this? This is one of the things that we talk with Matthew Webster on this surprising episode. I'm your host, Mathieu Peteau, and today on the podcast we have Matthew Webster, an achieved author, cybersecurity specialist who has a very good talent that I recognize as being able to explain complex stuff in very easy analogies, and this is what stood out to me in his book, and we have him today on the show. Matthew, welcome to the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Matthew, you're on LinkedIn and you make a lot of comments about the latest changes in cybersecurity and medical devices. And one thing that you pointed out is how the changes that are coming into regulatory that, I'll let you talk about it, about what Joe Biden might have installed.
Sure. So this is creating letter grades for IoT devices.
Mm-hmm.
Now, IoT devices are not IOMT devices, but they are still considered IoT devices. So if you get a letter grade of, like in the United States, we have A, Bs, and Cs. So an A is like a top grade, a C is average, and F is failing. So if you could say to your company, hey, we're only going to work with medical devices that have an A or a B grade, that goes a long way towards helping organizations, because then they don't have to do this in-depth analysis of the security behind the companies. Like you would never give a company that couldn't patch their software an A grade.
Mm-hmm.
You know, things like that just make perfect sense to me. So I'm very happy with changes like that, but that's just one of a lot of different changes that are out there. So.
Oh, yeah, I think it's a great idea. And in Europe, we have a similar standing in terms of how we can choose the healthiness of our food. So, if we're going to put something in our bodies that are medical devices, it'd be also great to know how cyber secure they are. Do we know to what extent this is going to be applied at the moment?
Not yet. It's still waiting to see the full fruition, because you can have something that's out. You can have here's the standard, but it takes time to adopt that standard.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of the manufacturing companies, you still need to figure that out, because then you've got pricing models and then you get the competitive edge that comes in there. So there's a lot of decisions that are going on, because the reality is you're dealing with a very competitive market. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of companies, it's all about what's the fastest time that you can get a new medical device that's out. A lot of the companies, what they're doing, if they're selling, they're trying to get their technical people in working with the doctors as they're using the device, say, what can we do to make our product better? And if you're the end user of it, like, wow, you're helping me, you're able to make changes on the fly like that, you're fantastic. I love working with you. So it makes them very happy, but the security sometimes can lapse as a result of that. So in the book, I talked a little bit about UL 2900, which is there's a public-private partnership between the Veterans Administration to come up with a standard for hardening systems and making sure that you've got a device that's really good. So if you purchase a medical device that meets UL 2900 standards, you've got good security behind it. The trade-off is the innovation. So sometimes you're dealing with the security versus the innovation, because if you make a change to it, are you still going to be compliant? Are you still following the practices? So companies do have to make trade-offs like that, but I think these are good discussions to have, and it starts pushing us in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. You talked about something that attracted my attention. Is the fact that it's beneficial for patients to have updates once the device is already released. Can you tell us more about it? How is it beneficial?
Well, let's say a doctor finds something annoying, or it slows them down if they're in the middle of surgery or in the emergency room. Mm-hmm. Maybe they need to do something that's a little bit faster, because every second can matter in a life and death situation. So then they modify it a little bit. Oh, then it's going to be easier. Maybe they're using it to interface with another type of device that they hadn't worked before. They would like some sort of integration between the two devices. That's a win, because all of a sudden those two devices are integrated. They don't have to manually have somebody put the information in from one device to another. They're just integrated automatically. Because that's the thing. There's a lot of companies developing these things, and if they aren't coordinating with one another, which happens all the time because there's too many companies and too many different devices that are out there, speed matters. Yeah. Time can kill. So.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd also, being able to update things and make changes to your medical device can also be very beneficial for cybersecurity as well, right? For dealing with vulnerabilities.
Oh, yeah. That is.
Yeah, why is it? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Tell me, Matthew.
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously, it's a huge issue because if you can't patch your device, that's a big problem. A lot of IoT devices are unpatchable.
Hmm.
So let me put this in context. In the book, I kind of talked about it. It's actually increased greatly since then. But at the time of the writing, something like 1,000, there's 1,111 vulnerabilities were found in Windows 7.
Mm.
Now, Windows 7 is end of life. And so there's a report out that came since I wrote the book that said that 83% of devices are actually not patchable, not
Oh.
updatable. So that's just with the operating system level. But there's another issue too, because it's not just the operating system level, it's because of the manufacturer saying, we don't want you to update that device operating system. So sometimes it's based on Windows, sometimes it's just simple stuff that's put into the IoT device itself. There's a lot of different approaches that companies are taking, but a lot of these devices are based on Windows. And
Hmm.
so that creates vulnerabilities. If you can't patch it, you can't update it. That's a huge issue because you've just got vulnerabilities that are sitting there. And to kind of add more pain to it, a lot of times you cannot install any type of software on the system. You can't do anything to modify it. You can't patch it. You can't update it. You just have this vulnerable system that's out there that you have to use network based controls in order to protect it. So, for those who are not familiar with network based controls,
Hmm.
I'm talking about packet like software that's coming over the wire that's connecting into the device that can help protect that system. So you can have like a firewall. And for those who don't know what firewalls are, it can basically block off that traffic. So if that traffic's coming in, you're able to prevent attackers from getting in. But on the reverse side, because the issue with a lot of the IoT devices is that's where the hackers sit because you can't detect that they're there. So you have to use other types of mechanisms and stuff that's sitting on the operating system itself. So this could be like intrusion detection systems, which have some awareness of what's going on from a network perspective and can block it if it's set up properly. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do, but you've got all these compensating mechanisms for a fundamental flaw in many of the devices that are out there.
Hmm. Yeah, and you say if 83% of medical devices are running on outdated systems that cannot be patched, then how can we do that thing we just talked about earlier, which is updating medical devices to have more benefits, be more secure, and overall provide a higher benefit risk ratio for the patient?
So it starts with the manufacturing process. Companies need to be able to patch the software. You can patch it, and then you're worried about some sort of problem occurring with your software. Your software wasn't built in a robust fashion. At the same time, internal processes you have to be very careful of. Now we have the hindsight of the CrowdStrike incident from last year.
Hmm.
It can be potentially deadly to people to update the operating system and create an outage with a particular medical device that's out there. So we have to be very mindful of that. If you update it and then all of a sudden most of your hospital system isn't working properly, that's a huge issue. So we have to be very mindful of what that's like. I think the companies need to be very careful. I'm sure that most of the medical device manufacturing companies have talked about that incident at the very least, because if all of a sudden you allowed something like CrowdStrike on your system and it prevented the system from running properly and it accidentally killed somebody,
Hmm.
that's going to hit the news. And
Oh
so
yeah.
they're terrified of this. And so you've got this sort of existential challenge that the manufacturers are dealing with. How do we do this in a secure way? And so, because the risk of human life is so high and the impact of that device is so high, they're scared of doing things one way or the other. It isn't like you automatically know, hey, we know we're going to be safe because you don't understand what all the different vendors are doing. And so, you've got to develop robust practices to make sure that you're updating. And so we think, hey, this is pretty simple. Well, the reality is it isn't.
Hmm.
You can have in a standard hospital, I can speak more from a US perspective than I can a global perspective, but it's not uncommon to find 10 to 15 devices per bed. If you've got 200 beds in a hospital, that's a lot of medical devices. And
Hmm.
so, how do you begin to update those? A lot of them, they don't have centralized management of the medical devices. So then how do you update each individual device? Then you've got to manually go up to it and replace it. This is not true across the board, of course,
Hmm.
but it becomes a big challenge for organizations because this is a big process. And for many of these devices, like let's say you're going to deal with a modern day CAT scanner, you know, it could be, definitely far above $1 million for one of those. Are you going to replace it because the operating system's out of date, but it's still got good information? You're not going to do it. It doesn't make good financial sense. So you've got to strategize things from an IT perspective in a little different way in order to protect that device properly. But a lot of organizations don't have that infrastructure set up properly.
Yeah. And when you mean organizations, are you talking about the manufacturers or the hospitals?
Hospitals.
Yeah, I think that's what you talk about, that there's many medical devices and it's hard to update them all. I think that's the key difference with between medical device and regular IT, where you have things like CrowdStrike that will update multiple times a day. In medical devices, we have to take a little bit more time to test what we do and update. We're much more of a slower industry when it comes to cybersecurity, because what you're saying, that there's so many medical devices and we can only update so many. So as a medical device manufacturer, if you're looking to have a device that stays competitive throughout time, how do you go through this process of communicating with the hospital, who's ultimately going to be the one doing the patching, to make sure that your device stays competitive over time and delivers the benefits that it's supposed to deliver to the patients?
I think they've just got to invest more in their development process, and make sure that things are done. They've got to do the appropriate testing, and that can be tough. And they're in a little bit of a bind too. So if you create a brand new medical device, for example, the FDA may take 7 years to approve, and you trying to update an operating system during the middle of that can definitely create some additional challenges. And the FDA does not like when you make those types of changes. So you've got this structure that's built into the United States. Again, I can't speak for the rest of the world, where that ends up being a bit of a problem for the manufacturer. And then the end result is the hospitals are caught in the middle of that. But the lucky thing is the process for getting updates to devices is much faster once you get it out there and you're doing incremental changes. So I think creating those types of processes is the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But what a lot of companies have done, though, and I mentioned the UL 2900, the Veterans Administration, is move towards a standard like the UL 2900 because it is going to be a lot better from a cybersecurity perspective, because they can't have all these devices going down. But the other thing, too, I think there's another angle to take a look at here, because you've got hospitals that are sometimes, at least from a study that came out from Health and Human Services within the US, that hospitals sometimes get hit up to 3 times per year for ransomware, and even more for some of them. So you're talking about multi-millions of dollars of loss that they're experiencing as a result of ransomware. They have to make some changes.
Mm-hmm.
But the sad thing is, when you're looking at the results of where companies are at, they're not making the changes fast enough within the organizations to affect change. Now, some hospitals are starting to go in that direction. I know hospitals that are doing a bang up job. I stand behind them. I think they're doing great. But a good number of the hospitals don't have the resources.
Mm-hmm.
Like New York City, which is where I'm in right now, New York City tends to do a little bit better because there's such a volume of people coming in. So you've got the resources to really manage things. But if you're talking about a rural hospital that's out away from other places and they don't get all the bandwidth and all the people coming in, that can be a huge economic challenge to try to build things properly. I talked a little bit about VLANs in the book, which is, for those who don't know, it's a virtual LAN. It's kind of a way of separating things, but then putting the firewall rules in place to block things off. That's probably one of the best defenses that you can have to protect a lot of these devices.
Mm-hmm.
So it is something that's going to be a challenge. Is there a perfect answer for the medical device community? They're going to need to up their game, but then they're going to need to charge more. And so then that becomes where that balance comes in from a purchasing versus security process. And so I think some of this has to come back to the hospitals, who have to say, look, we're not willing to accept these poorly secured devices because it's supply and demand. If the demand is saying we need better and nobody's going to purchase a device with bad security, they're not going to sell devices with bad security. They're going to
Mm-hmm.
build the security into it, because you're looking at this whole ecosystem of supply and demand that needs to be thought about, where security is part of that equation. So I think, we're seeing the beginning stages of that. We've seen it for a few years. Um, there is I Am the Cavalry, which was a gentleman who was out working on these things. And I was listening to a presentation with him and with some of the others where he changed it to We Are the Cavalry. But they did bring in a couple of manufacturers who are starting down the road of trying to secure those medical devices voluntarily without having to go the next step. So there's hope that we're moving in the right direction. Is it enough hope and is it fast enough? That's a whole other question, because you
Mhm.
look at a lot of hospitals, what they're doing is they're storing these medical devices sometimes for 10 or 15 years. You can't update the operating system. And a lot of times the hardware it's based on won't even take a new operating system for a lot of these devices. And that's where the crux of the challenge comes in for a lot of these organizations, because
So
it's going to take years and decades in some cases to get rid of those old devices with a lot of flaws in them.
yeah, absolutely. So I think what we're saying here, Matthew, is that the cybersecurity of hospitals and their numerous ransomware attacks are in part coming from medical devices. Then,
In part, yeah. There's much more to it, but definitely has that. So if you take a look at the broad scope of things, they end up sending emails they shouldn't be sending, or the information goes to the wrong person. There's a lot of like cases like that that are
hmm
going on when you look at in the US, we have something called the wall of shame. Um, and what the wall of shame is, if you've received a breach and you're a healthcare company, that's going to be put up on that wall of shame for 2 years. So a lot of companies don't like to report. We've seen that in some cases. And I've heard actually somebody speak from uh, OCR, the Office of Civil Rights here in the United States. And she was saying that they did not go after Change Healthcare, which definitely had a breach, but they had to go after them because the news had gotten so big that they couldn't ignore it anymore.
well,
So I think there are, and I found that enlightening because I figured that was something that you need to report. You need to report. If you're a good chief information security officer, you need to report that data. You need to put that out there. Like in some organizations, for example, I'd report things over to the FBI,
hmm
IC3, and they would come back and ask questions about that within a relatively quick period of time. But that reporting mechanism, it went out to the right people pretty quickly. That's part of the interesting thing that you have to take a look at is what are these laws? What are these agencies? What are they doing? How do they play into that big picture? Because things are not always as simple. But when you look at the data that they come out from that, a lot of that just misfires of email. But the rest of that is going to be standard IT issues, which of course you're going to have, but then the IOMT. But even if you're looking at a standard IT issue, like hacking or whatever, that's going to be somewhat dependent upon the IOMT. Because if you've got poor security over your IOMT and they're sitting there as sort of their safe harbor in their IoT device, and then that IoT device goes out and rehacks something 6 months later, what do you do about it? You know, you can only look at things from a network perspective.
yeah.
So it's a real challenge that hospitals are facing in terms of protecting their infrastructure, and which is why I'm so big on the network level defenses to protect these devices.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can't control the device itself, try to isolate it to prevent expelling it outwards. I think it's a very good point. But so far, it seems like the hospitals have been blamed for a lot of the cyber attacks, and at least here in Europe, I haven't seen too many fingers being pointed onto medical device manufacturers. Is this something you've seen or you expect to see in the future?
Well, hospitals ultimately bear the brunt of it. They're the ones who made the decision to go bring something in. They're the ones who made the decisions not to harden things. And so there's a cost that's associated with that. I know hospitals they're building out new facilities. They're thinking about all these things. How do we protect the devices from a medical perspective? Do they really need to talk to one another? Can they be separate on these
hmm
separate VLAN? But it is a large investment of time and resources to set up the network properly. If you go back to old hospitals that are not updating their systems, you have something called a flat network. Those who are not familiar with that means is it's basically wide open. They don't have any of that network segmentation, that VLAN that I spoke about earlier. And if you have it completely wide open, you can jump from standard IT to medical device IT very quickly. And there's basically nothing preventing that attack from going on except for the network level defenses and what our defenses are sitting on the standard IT infrastructure that's part of healthcare devices.
hmm Yeah, Absolutely true. Preventing that network piece is key. But, if I were to defend the medical device manufacturers, because maybe eventually the fingers will be pointed at them, I think a lot of them would say, well, there's not much we can do. It's at the hospitals, or sometimes it's at our patients' homes, and it's connected to Wi-Fi or to a phone we don't necessarily control. Do you think if they use these arguments, they're going to be able to get away from the burden of the cybersecurity that they hold of making sure their devices are secure?
So you bring up a really good point because a lot of the devices are exactly like you described them. People are going to use their personal phones. It's then connected into a pacemaker or other device that they might have connected to them. It's protecting their lives. And there's certain things that they can do and certain things they can't do. So one of the things I point out in the book, this is a real medical technology that's out there, is they have to be more careful about that. I mean, we've all heard I've seen a couple different explanations for this. The data is the new oil or data is the new gold, whatever interpretation you want to use. But one of the applications that's out there on the cell phone, the data literally went to 53 different countries.
Whoa,
Like,
53 different countries.
why on earth would you send your data, our US healthcare data, to 53 different countries?
Hmm.
That to me is really frightening to really stop and think about because you're not really following HIPAA. Now, you might have hired an outside company to do some of these things. They're like, oh, yeah, we'll just build it into the app. And you don't know what they're building into it. But if they're getting money and they're being helped to build devices that are actually sending data out, that's a big problem. You have to make sure that you're doing the appropriate testing with the applications in that process. Now, I'm not saying every company is going to do that. I'm just saying that there is an incentive out there for companies to sometimes not really care or to give that information out. Now, from a HIPAA standpoint, HIPAA is the US healthcare law. There's a lot more to it. I don't even want to go down that road,
Mm-hmm.
but the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. It's been updated in 2005, but there are anonymization requirements for HIPAA. So some of that information could be going out in an anonymized fashion. It may not be, but that's not something the researchers were paying attention to when you're looking at those things. But it still leaves a lot of questions open for what's actually going on. Where is our data going? How is it structured? And so on. I mean, there are so many other little facets of things because you've got this whole ecosystem. The manufacturer can be held responsible for how it's storing it in the cloud. You can say, well, we're only going to use HTTPS connections,
Mm-hmm.
or they're not going to use HTTP connections. And just for that's secured versus unsecured for people who don't know. And if you're using an unsecured connection, they should be liable to have an application that sends things in plain text in that unsecured application.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to develop it, you have to test it, you have to make sure that it's done properly. We have something called the SBOM here in the US, the software bill of materials.
Yeah.
Check to see what's going into that. And you've got to have people on your staff to be able to check and saying, what is the real risk of having particular pieces of software? Sometimes it's not even in the hospital system, as you pointed out, it's on somebody's phone, collects the information, then goes out to the cloud service provider. So it is a whole ecosystem, but I still think they should be held liable for things that are within their control. If it's outside of their control, let's say they're using an old iPhone or something like that, it's tough because you're looking at human life versus I don't have money to go update my phone and buy a new iPhone or
Mm-hmm.
new Android. So in those particular situations, you're going to have to find another way to handle that. You can decide, hey, we're going to do that, but then what's going to happen? The hospital's going to put that extra burden on the end user, and they may hold on to these devices for years, but that does create other economic challenges across the board. Not everybody can afford to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think there's a common thing to what we're saying here, whether it's for hospitals or medical device manufacturers. A key solution seems to be isolating things whenever you can, right? It's whether it's an app on your phone or certain components of the device that don't need to communicate. Don't have them communicate if they don't need to, right? Just common sense sometimes. So we talked about privacy and HIPAA. I want to keep pushing the competitive aspect of it. So right now cybersecurity, I'd say it's pretty soft right now. As you said in the book, there hasn't been too many cases of cybersecurity incidents related to medical devices. I think that's good. But
So
yeah,
let me
go
back
ahead.
up a
Go
little
for
bit
it.
because it does depend. Nobody has, there was one case, and actually I found out afterwards that there was a case where somebody had died,
Mhm.
um, but they found out afterwards that they probably would have died anyway.
Yeah, you're
So you
talking
can
about
you
the
can argue
incident in
that.
Germany regarding
Yeah, yeah,
ransomware at a hospital, right? Yeah.
yeah. But the other side of the house is I stayed away from things like the personal hacking. I do bring it into the book and talk about it,
Hmm.
but people have died, let's say, from their insulin levels, and they're like, I'm not getting enough insulin. And so they'll hack the system in order to change the settings a little bit to give themselves what they need. And so that's another problem. You know,
Ooh,
there's an
interesting.
old expression, probably started well before I was jumping into cybersecurity. But if you have physical access to a box, you own it. And I've heard that at training conferences 15, 20 years ago, but it's a well known thing. But you're giving people a physical component. And if they're getting in there, they're reading how to hack the device online because they're not getting the treatment they feel they need, that becomes another risk. So there are cases where people have died as a result of hacking themselves. And that's another big concern out there.
Wow. So people have been hacking themselves because their device is basically
Their own device.
malfunctioning. Then trying
Well,
to.
the device is functioning properly the way it
Uh
was
huh.
designed to, but they aren't necessarily, they don't feel like they're getting the help that they really need. So then they modify the device to get the help that they feel that they need because they're in pain or have other issues or whatever the story may be. And that's a challenge too, that we really need to make sure that the systems are unhackable, even from a physical perspective.
And
And so
perhaps. Hmm.
yeah. Oh, I just think that that's something you need to focus on as a manufacturer. You've got to consider these cases when they come in. Are you being proactive? Like, hey, we've got a gap here that we need to resolve that somebody found. Let's try to resolve it. And I think with some manufacturers, they're starting to go in that direction. As I said, there's some proactive effort that's going on, but there probably is not enough of that right now.
Yeah, I see. And to go along with your point, you often think about cybersecurity being very technical coding, but I think a lot of it is also the usability piece, where you think if the patient is struggling with a dosage issue, where they think that they're not getting what they want, then there might be something within the device that's not really at all related to cybersecurity, where you could say, "This is the dose that you're getting. Trust us. This is good." Maybe like a little bar, progress bar, something, or maybe perhaps training the staff of the hospital as well to be able to have these communications around these devices. What's
I
your thought
think
about
they
this?
do. I mean, the reality is like, look, I've given this to you. Like I've seen this in some cases where I've given you the appropriate dosage. I don't feel comfortable giving you more or less because I've measured your body weight, I've measured this, and the people like, I know better than you. So I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. So you're looking at some improvement. I always, if there's improvement, do that, make sure. But I think a lot of the doctors are educated in that,
Yeah.
depending on the organization. You're always going to have exceptions. So you'll be able to find those. But, I think that's going to have a marginal impact and marginal improvement.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many diabetes patients that you're just going to have a handful always. So you're right that you have to go beyond just this usability piece and try to
Yeah.
lock down the system as much as you can and try to get some pen testers perhaps before you release it. But as we said, it's always a challenge because there's vulnerabilities out there. So
Yeah.
yeah, being able to update on the go is an excellent way to do it. Matthew, thanks a ton for being here. If people,
Absolutely.
you've written a book. The title's quite long. Would you like to share it? And anyway, I'll share the link in the description. What's the title of the book?
Sure. It's Do No Harm, Protecting Connected Medical Devices and Healthcare and Data from Hackers and Adversarial Nation States.
Yeah, and it's good. Folks has got a great overview of everything around cybersecurity medical devices. So do check it out. And if people want to hear more about you, should they connect on LinkedIn?
Absolutely. I'm all over LinkedIn, so feel free to connect, reach out to me there. And I'm happy to have a conversation. If you need help or you're looking strategies on how to handle your hospitals or how to build it up and what's the return on investment from a cybersecurity perspective, I get into risk quantification, including hospitals and others. That's something that I can do because I can help create that business case. And that's part of what I do at my company right now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Matthew, for coming, and see you on the next one.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Alright folks, what episode it's been. I'm going to share with you my top 3 learnings that I had from this episode so that you can apply them to your organization. And if you'd like to hear more about one of these, the first one I'm going to explain, you can subscribe to my newsletter at cyberdoctornotes.com. So it's my newsletter where I share weekly insights, and I'm going to give you my top 3 right now that I learned from this episode. Number 1 is implementing network segmentation within your devices. Look, if you cannot have a device that can be patched itself, then make sure it's blocked off from the rest of the network as much as possible so that it does not have access ways in order to be hackable, right? Because if something's not accessible, it cannot be broken into. Number 2, demand standard processing in procurement. So hospitals are looking more and more into medical devices that are secure, follow a common process, and are more secure than the competition, and therefore help your sales process. And number 3, balance innovation with security. With the CrowdStrike incident, we have to make sure that we also have strong standard processes in how we do patching and understand that there's consequences to what we do. I think medical devices companies do a good job at this. It's always important to test out things before you put it on the market, and it can have certain consequences as well. So we have to make sure that we're patching in the right timing and we do the proper tests before releasing them to the public. Great. My name is Mathieu Peteau, Cyber Doctor. Please sign up to my newsletter, cyberdoctornotes.com, and I'll see you on the next one.